I'm really excited to welcome you to this special conversation, Living the Climate and COVID Emergencies, Apocalypse or Awakening, featuring Matthew Fox and Karen Mahon Carrington. So much of what we do at Hollyhock starts with the land, so I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from Bowen Island, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish people. Its traditional name is Nalelekum. Our Cortez Island campus is on the traditional ancestral land of the Tokaimu, Holmoko, and Klaman people. I wanted to start by saying how present this talk is for us at Hollyhock right now. As an organization that's raison d'être is bringing people together to connect to place, themselves, and other people, the COVID pandemic has felt like a journey between apocalypse and awakening. There's so much fear and birth in this current moment, and I'm really honored to welcome both Matthew Fox and Karen Mahon Carrington tonight. I wanted to start with just introductions. I've known Karen for a long time. She's a lifelong environmentalist, trainer, and teacher. She was a principal architect in the landmark campaigns to protect the old-growth rainforests of Clayoquot Sound and the Great Bear Rainforest on Canada's west coast. Her latest project, Climate Hope, is an invitation to build spiritual and emotional resilience, to engage with the climate reality from a place of resilience and productivity. So glad to have you, Karen. And Matthew Fox is a spiritual theologian, an Episcopal priest, and an activist for gender justice and eco-justice. He has written 37 books that have been translated into over many other languages over 70 times. He holds a doctorate in history and theology of spirituality and is the founder of the University of Creation Spirituality in California. I spent some time looking into Matthew Fox in anticipation of this program, and I found some really interesting details of his life, and particularly his relationship with Pope Benedict XVI. I want to share a couple of those with you right here. In the mid-1980s, Matthew began to refer to original sin as the original blessing. And it turns out that Cardinal Ratzinger, as Benedict was known at that time, didn't really appreciate this. And so after some investigations, Matthew was banned from speaking or teaching for a year in 1988. When the year was up, he started his very first speech by saying, "As I was saying 14 months ago when I was rudely interrupted." Then 16 years later, when Cardinal Ratzinger was named Pope in 2005, Matthew went to Martin Luther's church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed 95 theses on the door calling for a new reformation. I want to read you one of the opening lines from that new call that Matthew put on the door of that church in 2005. He said, "Today in 2005, we find ourselves in a situation analogous to that experienced by Luther in his time, but with the added dimensions of all seriousness. Human beings, along with thousands of other species on the planet, face a peril of potential extinction that has not been witnessed on Earth in 65 million years." It's a total honor to welcome both Karen and Matthew Fox here tonight to be in conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen now. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, KK. Thank you all for joining us. And today is the day that I have a heavy heart. There is so much pain in the world right now. So I would like to invite us to start with a moment of silence for George Floyd, the Black man who was killed at the hands of Minneapolis police this week. A moment of silence for the loss due to the human lives that are lost due to COVID, the suffering that COVID has brought to so many. And for the human and more than human lives that have been lost to the climate emergency. So I think we can feel it in the air right now, the loss and the grief. So let's just take a moment to gather ourselves and turn our hearts towards those that we have lost. There must be among us those whom can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. Those are the words of feminist poet Adrienne Rich. There must be among us those who can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. Yesterday, I was a weeping warrior. Yesterday, it just all got to me. The images of the protesters protesting the racial violence and brutality against Black Americans, out in the streets wearing their COVID masks, doing their best to make sure that they were not the cause of any harm to any other human being while they were out protesting for human dignity. Yesterday, it got to me and I let myself grieve. I let myself weep. I mean, at some point I heard myself really wailing, really let myself grieve. And today was a better day. Today was a good day. Today I felt the light on the trees. I heard the birds. And today I had a full heart. And I have really been studying grief and what it means to grieve for the past several years. More broadly, what it means to live a meaningful life, a meaningful, purposeful, joyful life in this time of what feels like collapse, what feels like the loss of so much of the world that we've known. And I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm indebted to Matthew for much of that. And this practice of grieving has really opened up the world for me in a new way, with a new vitality. In the introduction, Peter kindly said I worked as an environmentalist for most of my life. And some years ago, I was appointed to a government panel in Alberta with 5 CEOs of oil companies, 5 environmentalists, and 5 community and Indigenous leaders. We were coming up with a climate policy for Alberta, which for those of you that might not know is the oil producing province in Canada. It was a 2-year process, and you can imagine it was long and grueling. And after one long day of meetings, the facilitator of the process really insisted that we go out for dinner together, to have a friendly dinner to try and build morale and rapport between us all. So I find myself in a private dining room in the basement of some fancy restaurant in Calgary, sitting beside the CEO of Shell. And the conversation turns to the electrification of transportation, electric vehicles. And I say, well, this is going to be a huge thing for your industry as car and truck transportation, eventually other forms turn to renewables. How do you think about that? And he said, well, that's not going to happen. I said, what do you mean that's not going to happen? Now, keep in mind, this is a few years ago, before the major car companies started producing electric vehicles. And he said, it's not going to happen. There won't be a wide uptake of electric vehicles. It will be small internal combustion engines. And, I said, oh, come on, you're too smart to, this is going to happen. You don't have to say that. At this point, it was just he and I in conversation. But he said, no, I really believe it. And in that moment, I realized that we are all so conditioned by the world that we have known that it is almost impossible to really think about the world that needs to be born for us to live in a stable environment, for us to live the lives that our hearts desire. And I wonder, not only, what cannot he not see? A very bright, very informed, very interesting, charismatic man. He can't imagine a world that's not built on the oil industry. And what are the limitations that we all have? What can't we see? And so through that event and other climate activism, and by the way, we went on to create an amazing climate policy for the province of Alberta. It was the first oil producing jurisdiction in the world to pass a price on carbon. And it was a great piece of work. And then 2 years later, the government was defeated and a conservative government came in and undid it all. So through all of that, I realized that I do not believe that we can now escape the possibility of a world that is 2 degrees warmer than where we are now, at least. I think we have a huge responsibility, I think we all do, to make sure it's not a 3-degree world or a 4-degree world. But we do have to prepare ourselves for the levels of collapse and chaos that are coming and that are already upon us. And so how do we do that? How do we teach our children the emotional, spiritual resilience skills that they're going to need to get through a world of this level of chaos and disarray? And so I set about looking across the traditions of the world, the wisdom traditions, cultural traditions, to say, what have humans learned before? I mean, humans have known this kind of feeling of collapse or ending of civilizations before, through wars, through famine, through other more potent pandemics. And I looked at all the traditions through Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism, and I found that pretty much every tradition talks about the holding of the light and the dark, life and death, the balance, the paradox of it is at once so beautiful. I mean, I can hear the little birds outside my window, and I'm here talking to all of you, and I can feel your hearts if I let myself tune in. And it's bloody tragic. I mean, the suffering is overwhelming. So the holding of that paradox of light and dark is a central teaching of every tradition. And then when we hold that paradox, from that and from really letting the grief move through us, letting the grief kind of, let ourselves move towards the darkness instead of away from the darkness, we find that taking on grief is kind of an act of, it's an act of service to the greater world, to the suffering of the greater world. Those of us that can be here tonight, that can be sitting in our homes, on our computers, and are safe and sound, grieving is kind of a revolutionary act that we can really take on for the soul of humanity, to help it move, take on the suffering, move through it. And when you move towards it and take it on, I have found it really becomes like a compost that breaks down life into its essential nutrients and creates new life. And so from this paradox of light and dark, you get creation, you get birth. And from that birth, the new path emerges. So I found this pattern, and then I found that this long distant teacher of mine, Matthew Fox, had been writing, in fact, about this pattern for many decades. And the 4 paths, the positiva, the via creativa, and via the rate to deal are resonant in gratitude, grief, seeing with new eyes and going forward. You find them resonant in the Taoist traditions, in Buddhist traditions. And so I have been working with the 4 paths for some time since then, using the 4 paths as a way to navigate this time of upheaval and uncertainty. I've been using the 4 paths with community groups, with climate professionals, with climate concerned folks of all kinds. And I have found it to be an incredibly potent tool in helping us ground and find our way through this time, which is, like every time is a time like any other, but the level of change right now is so astounding, isn't it? COVID has turned the volume up so high on all the things that we already knew, but has made them so much more intense. And so I went back and looked at the works of Matthew Fox, and Matthew, when I read your original blessing now, it literally as if you wrote it for today. I often open the book and read it out loud, and it sounds as if you wrote it last week. It's so essential to the human condition under these times of stress and chaos. And so I'm thrilled and delighted that you're here with us today to talk about, are we living in apocalypse or are we living in awakening? And, I ask myself that question, and I say to myself, absolutely, we're living in apocalypse. Absolutely, we are living in a time of loss. We are living in a time of endings. Pandemics are as sure a sign of climate change as forest fires and sea level rise. Yet no one I know in the climate adaptation community, I do climate adaptation planning with different organizations, imagined that it was going to come this quickly and this swiftly and be this impactful to the world that we know. So we are living in a time of apocalypse, and certainly we are. And an apocalypse, the root meaning of apocalypse is revelation. It refers to an unveiling. It's from the Greek, an unveiling, an unfolding of things not previously known and which could not have been known apart from the unveiling. So what has been unveiled to us through this time of apocalypse? Certainly our connection with the natural world, our connection with each other. It has laid to rest the lie that we are separate from nature. We are so clearly not. So we are living a time of apocalypse. We feel that. And we're also living that time of awakening. This idea that we can slow down if we want to, that we can make different choices, that we can look at how we've stopped air travel. I don't believe that the COVID crisis has been good for the climate necessarily in terms of, CO2 emissions, and we want to talk about those sorts of things. But what it has been good for is understanding that we are capable of radical change on a massive scale, if and when we choose to. That has been a very profound lesson. And of course, there have been some gifts around slowing down and learning what we can live without. So there's no doubt that it's also a time of awakening. So that's how that's for me how this program comes to be, and I am just so delighted that we get to hear from Matthew on these topics of apocalypse or awakening. Over to you, Matthew.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. It was Karen's idea to bring us all together, so I give her special credit for her imagination and her perseverance and stubbornness, holy stubbornness, bring us together. And of course, to Hollyhock and for creating the platform where we can all get together to reflect on these important issues. And I think Karen has just done an excellent job in laying out the circumstance which brings us together. In light of last night's events in Minneapolis, I kind of tweaked my topic a bit today to talk not just about the 2 C's, but the 3 C's. So there's COVID-19, there's climate change, and the 3rd C that I want to name, and they're all interconnected, is what I call the crack in the Liberty Bell. The crack in our, what should I say, our rather haughty view of ourselves. I'm speaking now as an American, the USA, but Canada has its own shadows to deal with too. Around, of course, this issue of racism, that America's history for 400 years, there's been a crack in the Liberty Bell. Even Thomas Jefferson waxed eloquent about all men are created equal, but he had slaves, of course, as did most of the founding fathers in America. And so, but the slavery issue began long before America began. 1619 it began, so it's been over 400 years. And then it's not just the Black slaves, it is, of course, the Indigenous people. And this is where Canada's consciousness has risen, I think, considerably in my lifetime too. And so the put down of other cultures than European culture has been baked in to these experiments, these Enlightenment experiments that we love to call democracy and so forth and so forth. But of course, today we know that given the COVID crisis, that I think it's 4 times more Black Americans are dying from it than white Americans, and 3 times more Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans than white Americans. And so, and it's not because there are more Blacks and more Hispanics than there are white people. It's because there's a class issue, there's an educational issue, there's access to health issue, health care, and there's access to healthy food issue, and access to healthy air. And that's where, of course, the climate change comes in. That the eco crisis is also a racial crisis. For example, Black children born in South LA in Watts grow up with 1/3 the lung capacity of other children in the United States. And you know, when your lung capacity is restricted, so is your brain capacity, your physical health, and the rest. And so I see these 3 C's truly interacting. As Karen alluded to, obviously the coronavirus is related to climate change. After all, the HIV virus began in Africa with monkeys, and it killed 39 million human beings. And now we have a virus that apparently began with bats in China, and it is romping around, not just killing people directly, but indirectly through lack of jobs and the rest, and suicides and depression and all the rest. So why is this happening? Karen alluded to it, but just to make it more explicit, it's because we have robbed so many other creatures of their habitats that we are overtaking other creatures' domains so rapidly that not only are many going extinct or threatened with extinction, but many of them are interacting with us, which is not healthy for them or us on a much closer scale. So there's so many ways in which the climate change, COVID-19, and what I call the crack in the Liberty Bell, the racism that has driven so much of the capitalist enterprise in the West, the taking of the rainforest, which is obviously still going on today, and in fact has been advanced under the new president of Brazil, and the taking of the gold and everything from the Americas, and of course the raping of the soil and rivers and trees and so much else. We're becoming more and more conscious of the price we're paying. What Hildegard of Bingen called the web of creation. We are part of a web of creation. And this has become a pretty common image recently, and that's nice to hear. But back in the 12th century, she came up with that phrase, that creation is a web. And while a web, of course, is flexible and strong in its way, it also has limits. And she says, if humans, by our arrogance, rupture our just relationship with other beings, with other creatures, she says God will allow creation to punish humanity. So she doesn't talk about God as a avenger with lightning, but that Mother Earth will do the waking up. And I have to say that my current thinking about the coronavirus is that it may be still another wake-up call. Still another. There are so many. Think of Australia last summer. I mean, we talk about a canary in a mine. Australia is a continent in a mine. The whole thing was ablaze. And how much has that woken us up? And of course, I live near northern, where a lot of these forest fires are happening on a regular basis now. And almost any month of the year. It used to be 1 or 2 months. And of course, we had a 7-year drought in the state of California, etc. So I was part of this a wonderful gathering a few summers ago of IRA, the Institute of Religion and Science, on an island off in New Hampshire. And the theme is climate change. And it was a very powerful experience to listen to these scientists talk about, not only listen to them talk about what's going on and to warn us. They said, in layman's language, wet places will get wetter, dry places will get drier. And of course, that's what's happening. And of course, dry places means drought, which means, of course, the food chain gets cut drastically. And but also I was moved at the end of the week. Well, first of all, I was moved by the humanity of the people there. I was invited to talk about the Pope's Encyclical Laudate Si on the environment. One of my students had actually written most of it. And but when it was my turn to talk on a Wednesday morning, we've been there about 3 days, I put aside my talk and I said, you know, I don't think I should talk about this. You can look at my webpage, I've written about it. I think I should talk about what's going on here. And I said, what's going on here is despair. I'm feeling it everywhere. And I think we should talk about it. We've got to talk about despair. This is part of the grief that Karen's talking about. Despair is in the air. There are people who are actually forming groups, kind of like AE groups or something like that, where they've made a decision that it's over for humanity. And they're just going to kind of get together every 2 weeks or so, kind of like a church of despair, where they'll hold each other's hands or something, but they've given up. And you know, Thomas Aquinas says despair is the most dangerous of all sins, not the worst. Injustice is the worst, but despair is the most dangerous, he said, because when people are in despair, they don't care. They don't care about themselves, and they surely don't care about anyone else. And so the passion for justice and the passion for service, the important word that Karen introduced, the passion for reimagining the way we live on the earth, the way we interact with one another, with ourselves, with the planet and other creatures, that simply is lost. That, as Aquinas says, compassion leaves when fear takes over the human heart. And fear is he points out, is the springboard for despair. So, you know, just like Karen named grief as being so important to pay attention to today. And I couldn't agree more. And of course, we saw it on television last night. The first level of grief is anger. And we saw that rage burning down buildings in Minneapolis. And the response to injustice necessarily brings moral outrage and anger. Aquinas says all anger is related to experience of injustice. And we saw that on display yesterday. We also have to bring this anger to the work of climate change. Climate change is a little bit slower in its presence. We can hide from it longer than you can hide from coronavirus. But it's really the same dynamic. And it calls for a response of generosity and service, and of course science and creativity, a lot of which is on display. These crises we're talking about bring out the best in humanity and the worst in humanity. And that's where I wanted to tap into what Karen pointed out about our title here, the apocalypse or awakening. And I'm so glad that she brought in the word revelation, because as she pointed out, the Greek word for apocalypse, it's a Greek word, apocalypse, also means revelation. And so we have this choice as a species, as communities, as individuals. Will we just lay down and give up? Will we just go to grab our own piece of the pie, build our moats and all that thicker, spend even more on weapons? Will we go into denial? In America, a whole political party is in denial about climate change. It's just unbelievable. It's been going on for 25 years. It's unbelievable. The power of denial, what it can do to take over the human mind. Or, those are all options to kind of apocalypse. The other option is what Karen spoke to, the unmasking, the unveiling of two things. One, our capacity as a species for making leaps of consciousness, for moving from an anthropocentric consciousness, which Western culture has been stuck in ever since the Black Death of the 14th century, I think. Worried about our private salvation and afraid to die, and building structures of all kinds to feed our scared egos and our tiny souls to prevent death. And so in building a whole economic system on greed and avarice, and on separating ourselves from one another, on the survival of the fittest, on the reptilian brain, therefore, I win, you lose. All this is baked into the situation that Karen referred to, that if we're going to move on, we've got to let go. And that's what I love about the mystics, that they speak to the radicalness of letting go. There's this wonderful line from Howard Thurman, one of my favorite mystics, who was the spiritual director to Dr. King, Martin Luther King, and to the entire civil rights movement in America. He and his wife went and visited Gandhi in 1935 in India, the first Black couple to do so. And they brought back Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence and the rest to the Black community in America. And in one of his works, in many times in his works, he uses this phrase about being stripped to the literal substance of ourselves before God. Become stripped to the literal substance of ourselves before God. To me, that's one of the dimensions of revelation, of unveiling, that we learn who we are. We learn both the bad news and the potential good news. We learn that we are capable of going into denial, for example, about the truths of what we're doing to one another, to the planet, and to future generations, and of what we've done to previous cultures and what racism has done and the rest. We can go in denial about that, or we can unveil it, be stripped to the literal substance of ourselves before God. But also, part of the stripping is to get in touch with our immense capacity for imagination, for moral outrage, for birthing a new moment in the human evolution and human consciousness. We're at. I think that I was with quite a renowned biologist several years ago at Stanford. We're actually doing a sweat lodge together, no one at Stanford knows that he and his wife have a sweat lodge in their backyard. You can't do that and be academically respectable, I guess, at Stanford. But anyway, he told me, we are the first species in 4.5 billion years of the planet that can choose not to go extinct. That can choose not to go extinct. And then he added, but of course we haven't made that choice yet. Now that was about 12 years ago. Well, here we are. Here we have to make the choice. We've got less than 10 years left this is that report from a year and a half ago, the United Nations of scientists around the world, less than 10.5 years now to change our ways as a species. And now the coronavirus is here, the Australian fires are here. I think just kind of pinching us and saying, hey, are you awake yet? But we are capable of it. Our species has come so far and working so often out of trial and error and ignorance. One of my favorite stories is from the cosmologist Brian Swim, when he says that when humans left Africa about 65,000 years ago, we had fire, we had discovered fire, and we went wandering, as we love to do. We're curious, wonderfully curious. When we landed in what is now Eurasia, Europe and Asia meet, the Ice Age broke out. Just think about that. We had come to the savannas of Africa, and we're wandering and wandering, and we end up at this new place, and the Ice Age breaks out for 10,000 years. I mean, imagine how our ancestors had to hustle. I think they fought for about 10 years, saying, who turned off the lights, who turned off the heat? But anyway, you got down to it. They had to learn how to catch a woolly mammoth and skin it, and how to live in caves to avoid the wild saber-toothed tigers, and how to tell stories around campfires, hiding in these caves and all the rest. I mean, this is our DNA. This is our DNA. We are a species. And the fact that we're not teaching that to our children, because in my opinion, education is a complete failure in the West, because what we're talking about with the 3 C's is values. Values. What are the values that our species holds dear and worth suffering for and working for and serving for? And my take on education, I've been in education my entire adult life. You know, Tom Berry says the greatest failures of the 20th century were religion and education. And I've been involved in both. So I guess, I don't know if I'm masochistic or just unlucky. But anyway, I know education from the inside out. I have sat for hours with these popes of education who make up who gets accredited and who doesn't accredit and all that stuff. And I've watched them, I've listened to them. They haven't listened to me, I've listened to them. And there's not an ounce of values that ever comes through in their questioning. Not once was I questioned about the value of pedagogy, for example. It's such a big part of my alternative education. To educate our mystical brain, our intuitive brain, because as Einstein says, that is where values are found. But instead, we're only educating the analytic brain. And that itself does not give you values. Einstein said that. Values do not come from the intellect, he said. They come from intuition and deep feeling, which are the same thing. In other words, what I would call the right brain or the mystical brain. And this, it's a wasteland, even in seminaries. And of every denomination, every Western denomination, you don't find this kind of training. So I think the crisis we're facing as a species around the 3 C's has everything to do with values, and we're ill-equipped to deal with it if you think that academia has the answer. Now, academia gives us people who can chase the facts, the scientific mind, that's great. We need the facts, for sure. But we also need a great debate, a fierce debate about values. And because that's what's calling us forward at this time. Now, is there a timekeeper here? How much time do I have left? I don't know. I don't want to go overboard.
You still have some time, Matthew. Maybe you still have some time, maybe another 7 minutes or so.
Great. Oh, that's good news. Thank you.
And then we're going to open it up to Q&A just so people know what's happening.
That's right. Yeah, we get some interchange going. So that's what I'm so excited about this weekend, because I think we're going to be plummeting the depths of our true selves as a species. That's what the 4 paths do for us, I think. They help to name our capacity as a species. This is so important today, because that is where we plummet down to values. Who we are, why are we here, what can we bring to one another? For example, here's just one value. Thomas Aquinas says, joy is a human's noblest act. Joy is a human's noblest act. And this, he's talking about the via positiva, the first path, that we need to build up our muscles for joy, our muscles for wonder and awe and reverence and gratitude. But that's what it means to celebrate a sacred creation, the sacred earth. There's a wonderful teaching from Thomas Berry. I'm sure many of you know him, the eco-theologian. No, he called himself a geologian, not a theologian, which I understand. He didn't want the burdens of theology upon his back. But in a beautiful little book that gathered the meditations on nature by Thomas Merton. It's called When the Trees Say Nothing, Thomas Merton Writings on Nature, edited by Kathleen Danon. Thomas Berry did the foreword. And this is what he wrote. And you see, this is what I'm saying about the importance of values at this critical moment. And it takes us to a new level of thinking. By values, I'm not, well, let's get into this. Thomas Berry says, we have no inner spiritual development without outer experience. Immediately when we see or experience any natural phenomenon, when we see a flower, a butterfly, a tree, when we feel the evening breeze flow over us or wade in a stream of clear water, our natural response is immediate, intuitive, transforming, ecstatic. That's the via positiva. Everywhere we find ourselves invaded by the world of the sacred. We find ourselves invaded by the world of the sacred. That's the term I want to put forward, the sacred. The sense of the sacred, he says, is a basic flaw in many of our efforts at ecologically or environmentally adjusting our human presence to the natural world. The absence of the sense of the sacred is what's missing in a lot of our ecological endeavors. It has been said, we will not save what we do not love. It is also true that we will neither love nor save what we do not experience as sacred. In my book on One River, Many Wells, which is my journey into all the world's spiritual traditions, to find out what they have in common, and I came up with 18 themes they have in common. The first one is creation. And I find that all the world traditions have tried to teach their people about the sacredness of creation. Finally, he says, the deep psychic change needed to withdraw us from the fascination of the industrial world. Of course, Karen alluded to this, that we can't even see out of this bubble we're in, because, and this is pretty natural, that we're used to what we're used to. But that's what it means to move on, to go to another level of evolution, to move from what Pope Francis calls our narcissism as a species back of the sacredness of creation, something that previous religious cultures held dearly, certainly the indigenous people that we know today. That was ripped away from them, or was tried to be ripped away by so many of the missionaries from Europe. So Berry is saying the deep psychic change needed to withdraw us from the fascination of the industrial world, and it is fascinating, but it's also burning up in front of us. I mean, you could be fascinated by dread, you can be fascinated by evil, you can be fascinated by the awful, as well as being fascinated by the awesome. The deceptive gifts that this world gives us, he says, is too difficult for simply the avoidance of its difficulties or the attraction of its benefits. Eventually, only our sense of the sacred will save us. Only our sense of the sacred will save us. Now, that's what I mean by a value revolution, or revelation, or awakening. And what is a sense of the sacred? It's a sense that we did not make the world we live in. We did not make carbon dioxide. We did not make the lungs that process our breathing. We did not make the oxygen that was tuned just right by flowers so that this 10-mile bubble where we live offers us the healthy oxygen that we need as a species to survive and to thrive. We didn't make the forests, we didn't make the waters, the soil from where our food comes, the gorgeous animals, the elephants, the tigers, the whales, the fishes, the dogs, the cats, the horses. I mean, it was here for us. We arrived. And so a sense of the sacred is a sense of awe and of wonder, of gratitude. It is the via positiva of the mystic. And we need to take a really deep breath to put ourselves in that context of realizing again, realizing anew, that the whole world is sacred. Buck Ghost-Torres is a Lakota teacher who I worked with for years. We were good friends, a wonderful man. He ran Sundances for years. He's deceased now. But he was on our faculty for 4 years at Holy Names College, and he had a sweat lodge on campus, which I learned later disturbed people in the Vatican. But he said to me one day, you want to know how sacred water is? Go without it for 3 days and 3 nights. Then that first sip of water, you know what sacred is. Sacred is that gift that we may ordinarily take for granted. But I think the crisis we face today as a species, the climate crisis, the extinction rebellion in response to this, the crisis of extinction, our own and others. And now, of course, the crisis of coronavirus, which raises again the visibility of our mortality and of our humility, that we do not. This is such an occasion to awaken our species, to awaken our various cultures, all of which are beautiful, all of which hold great wisdom, all of which are deeply, deeply flawed. Deeply, deeply flawed. Same is true of our religion. And same is surely true of our profession. I don't know one profession that's healthy today. Take the legal profession. You know what burned those buildings down last night? You know what so outraged people? I mean, the murder was bad enough. But people weren't burning buildings down for several days after the murder. What burned the buildings down were lawyers who got up in front of a microphone, including attorney general this and then all kinds of titles and degrees they got for their left brains at their law school, who didn't know a damn thing about moral outrage, didn't have a clue about what they didn't do in front of the microphones would result in the rage of a people. And not just of the Black people of the community, but all kinds of people who were outraged by the murder and triple outraged by the non-response of these lawyers. And then in my country, we have a Supreme Court telling us, for example, in its immense wisdom, that corporations are people. Oh, really? And they have, oh, and that they can vote with whatever amount of money they want. Citizens United, we call it. It's the Dred Scott decision of the 21st century. It's unbelievable, and people kind of take it in stride. And many of the people on the Supreme Court who voted for that were far right-wing Catholics, because the far right-wing Catholic movement has been set ablaze by 34 years of fascist popes. The present pope is trying to turn away from that, and of course he's being hounded for doing so. But the point is that the sense of the sacred has become so scarce. It's not in our vocabulary. And here's a very important insight. I got this when I wrote my book on evil a few years ago, called Sins of the Spirit, Blessings of the Flesh, Transforming Evil in Soul and Society. And Deepak Chopra wrote a recent foreword to it. And in that foreword, he says, the number one spiritual issue of the 21st century is going to be evil. So we have to develop a vocabulary to talk about evil. And that's what I tried to do in my book by taking the 7 chakras of the East with the 7 capital sins of the West and bringing them together, Eastern and Western wisdom, about how to deal with this, the depths of humanity, its depths of greatness and its depths of shadow. But this is one thing I learned that's really important, and it's this. The opposite of evil is not good. Bad is the opposite of good. Bad is the opposite of good. What's the opposite of evil? The sacred. The sacred is the opposite of evil. And there's so much evil on the rampage today. Lies on the loose, and denial on the loose. Aquinas says to choose to be ignorant of something that is important is a mortal sin. In other words, a deadly virus that will affect far more than just an individual, but the community itself. A deadly virus. So we need a language to combat evil. And one reason, of course, in the trouble we're in is that religion has failed so much. It's so oversold the concept of that doesn't have anything to say about evil, because it's cried wolf so often about sin that no one's listening to what it has to tell us much about evil. But the crises we are facing, the 3 C's in this weekend, coronavirus, climate change, and the crack in the Liberty Bell called racism and colonialism, these are evil. It's like, and this is why they return with every generation. There's something spiritual about them. There's something immortal about them. They come back. And how do we humans get strong to not only name these evils, but to stand up to it? That warrior energy that Karen referred to. How do we develop warrior energy? That is, in my opinion, probably the primary question for all of education today. How do we get strong? And frankly, I don't expect most of academia to answer that question. And frankly, I don't expect most organized religion to give us ways either. But we do need practices. And we need this naming of the journey. And that's where I think the 4 paths and the wonderful practitioners of the 4 paths over the eons, people who, like Karen, have discovered these paths on their own. The path of the via positiva, negativa, creativa, and transformativa. This is what makes us strong. This is what makes us warriors. And I think our whole civilization has to center on the sacred. And that's what it means to talk about a spiritual journey. It means traveling into the depths of a person. Rabbi Heschel says, there lies in the recesses of every human existence a prophet. There lies in the recesses of every human existence a prophet. To me, warrior is another word for prophet. Warrior and prophet to me are synonyms. Prophet is a more common biblical term, although warrior is used in the Bible sometimes too, used of Jesus on several occasions. But the warrior How do we get to the recesses to bring the warrior alive, to bring the prophet alive? That's what I think the four pals help us with. They help to name the recesses in every one of our hearts. And because that joy of the via positiva is a recess, along with the awe, the wonder, the gratitude, and the reverence. The recess of grief in the via negativa of grieving, recognizing the suffering. But also the recess of silence of via negativa. The via negativa is also about meditation, the letting go of images and returning to silence, where things get reborn and let go of. And oh, we need that, as Karen said, we need that so profoundly today. We have to let go of a whole civilization. We have to let go of the entire modern agenda. We're living in a postmodern time. And this is where the pre-modern mystics are so useful, because they didn't live in the modern world. They didn't live in the modern world. And everyone who knows this, who knows the distinction between modern and postmodern, will recognize that the postmodern has more in common with the pre-modern. This is why we yearn to hear the wisdom of indigenous people today. And we yearn to hear the wisdom of our medieval ancestors, because they're pre-modern. And they don't begin, neither Native American nor medieval worldview begins with the human. It begins with cosmology, with the whole, with the holy whole, the sacred whole that is the universe. David Bohm, the physicist, said, I'm a postmodern physicist who begins with the whole, W-H-O-L-E. Yes, I say. That's why my theology is called creation spirituality. We begin with creation, not with humans and our sins, in our doubts, in our violence. Begin with the creation. It's 13.8 billion years wiser than humans. Even the Bible begins that way. The first page of the Bible is all about creation, and it keeps calling it good, good, very good, very good. That's what blessing means, original blessing. The word blessing is a theological word for goodness. But you know, most of Western religion, since Augustine, since the 4th century, of Western Christianity, has ripped the first page out of the Bible. It doesn't begin with the good of creation. It begins with Adam's sin, the fall. It's not where the Bible begins. It's unbelievable that we've wandered so far from what we call our holy book. But of course, we can call on Aquinas, who says, a pre-modern mystic and scientist, genius, he says, Revelation comes in 2 volumes, nature and the Bible. The modern agenda dropped the nature part. There's no seminary in the world that I know of that was anything like my school that had scientists on the faculty, preferably mystical scientists, and there are a lot of them bumping around these days, and artists who also tell us about nature, about human nature, about experiences of beauty and grief, our capacity for letting go. So there's great wisdom in our religious traditions around these themes of letting go, of fasting, the treasures of being able to let go. That's all part of the via negativa. Then another recess in all of us is our creativity. The very definition of a human person by anthropologists today is a biped who makes things. That's how they know our ancestors, when they find a biped with jewelry or artifacts next to it. Oh, that's our ancestor. Why? Well, it makes things. Creativity is at the core of who we are as a species. And how many of us have had any classes in all our education that brought that home? Creativity 101, 202, and the rest. And of course, this is what's going to save us, if anything can. It is our creativity today as a species. And then the via transformativa is about justice and compassion. This is the direction for our deepest selves. We take our joy, our silence, our grief, our creativity, into the arena of justice making and compassion and healing and celebrating. So these, I think, these four paths do what Rabbi Heschel says we must do. They get us to the depths of ourselves. And we can't project our prophetic callings, our warrior callings onto others. Everyone has to step up to the plate. It's time for all hands on deck. 18-year-olds and 80-year-olds have something to offer, and especially working together, intergenerational wisdom, bringing forward our passion for joy and love of the earth, via positiva and love of life, our passion for silence and for grieving. The passion and grieving includes anger, but dealing with it in a healthy way. Our passion for birthing, for creativity, and our passion for justice. Aquinas says, truth, the proper objects of the heart are truth and justice. Now that's an affront, I propose, to the entire modern educational experiment. It's not into the heart at all. It's all up in the head. One chakra, one half of the head is our definition of education. And that's why we're destroying the earth. That's why we're destroying the... Thomas Berry said, the number one cause of the destruction of the earth in our time, the 20th century and 21st century, is people with PhDs. Yeah.
What?
Someone has to say it. Someone has to tell the truth of the failure of academia to include values. Values like beauty. Values like compassion. Values like awe and wonder and a sense of the sacred. There's something bigger than us. Something bigger than our bank accounts and our pyramids and our towers with our names on them. Our egos, something bigger. And that includes future generations. That includes all the beings we're sharing the planet with. So the passion for justice, it's in our hearts. Of course, we have to use our heads. Yes, we need strategy. We need the facts. And science is such an important ally in all this. But we also need that mystical capacity in all of us to fall in love. And I don't mean falling in love with the two-legged one. There's enough of that. I'm talking about falling in love with all the beings of the planet that are calling to us today. They are grieving. They are grieving. They are losing so much. We're not the only ones who are losing a lot. And the climate change is not just about displacing millions upon millions of human beings. It's also about displacing millions of other species, many of whom are in fact our kin, our friends, our allies, the bumblebee, the insects, the trees, and all the creatures. So I think our weekend together here is very, very timely. And I thank Karen for the invitation and for all of you for showing up. I think that we're dealing with serious things. And I think that being able to plummet the depths of what it means to be human in a time of crisis like this, the triple crisis, the Trinitarian crisis, the 3 C's I speak of, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. And I look forward to hearing what others have to offer. We will be working in small groups tomorrow, as well as Karen and I doing some teaching and sharing. But I presume my time is about up. Is it?
Thank you, Matthew. That's great. So there's a number of us that have come together for the talk this evening. And there is if you're not aware or not registered in the workshop tomorrow, there's a workshop tomorrow. It's 2 2-hour segments, 10 to 12 and 2 to 4, where we're going to be exploring everything that we've been speaking about in an experiential way. So if you can join us, we'll send you an email later on about how to do that. And right now, what I'd like to do, we have 20 minutes left in this session, is open it up to questions from anyone online. I have some I want to raise. I see that Hollyhock Kate has put in the chat the link to register for tomorrow for the experiential workshops if you haven't already. And I invite you to put a chat a question in the chat. And I see there's a couple, but I want to get mine in first. And mine is this, Matthew. They feel like the invitation of this time is around letting go of the world that we knew. When I was a young mother, I was, struggling to figure out, what did this mean? It's a very different life when you have a young infant and when you don't. And one of my best girlfriends said to me, the sooner you give up chasing your pre-baby self, the better. The happier you will be. And I hear that now in my head, and I feel like the sooner we give up chasing the world that was, the better we will be. And the sooner we can move to embracing the new world that is coming into being, that the better off we will be, the better off our children will be. So before I turn it over to the group for questions, advice, wisdom on how do we really let go? I mean, really, really let go, because I do think that's the invitation of COVID.
Well, I love that story. I think it's a very concrete one, and I'm sure there are plenty of mothers online here with us who can identify with it. It's very practical too. Here's one way to put it. Nostalgia is not a virtue. Nostalgia is not a virtue. That temptation to live in the past. We have to watch out for it. And it's easier to live in nostalgia than it is to live in the real world, especially when the real world is becoming more and more crisis-ridden at this time in history. We just have to realize that, yesterday is yesterday. Now, Meister Eckhart has this teaching about letting go. He has a lot of teaching, but here's one of his sentences on that. He says, we sink eternally from letting go to letting go into the one. We sink eternally. To me, that's an amazing statement, because you're telling me we have to continually let go? It's eternal? Yeah, it is. We're continually letting go. And when you look back on it, at our lives, it's true that, to get married is also to let go. You might let go of a lot of boyfriends if you marry this particular man. And and you don't want to live in the past with those other boyfriends. You're committed to this, to try this new thing out. I think there's a tendency to, and of course that whole thing about grass is greener on the other side. Oh, things were so wonderful in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s.
What do you think?
But really, you look at it scientifically, you look at the facts, and things were not quite so wonderful. But I think there's great meaning, wisdom in that teaching from Eckhart. We sink eternally, but it's a sinking, notice. It's not a climbing. I think when we're climbing, we don't dare look down or look around very much. But I think that the letting go process is, and of course, this is part of the meditation experience, but there are many other ways in which we can choose consciously to let go. For example, today, diet is a tremendous issue when it comes to climate change. I had the privilege a few months ago of meeting this fellow at a conference at Sierra Club, Sailesha Rao. He wrote this book and some others, Carbon Yoga, The Vegan Metamorphosis. So this guy, he actually worked in Silicon Valley for years. I think he founded an important company and then quit to work 100% on climate change. And he's from India. So he got up and talked, and he had a slideshow. And he said, listen carefully, because what I will tell you will end climate warming in 10 years and set it back, set carbon back in 10 years. He said, this is what we do. We all become vegan. That is to say, we take back all the land the livestock around the world is using. And of course, that's not just land, but water and feed. We take that back and plant trees. And he said, I've done the math. And he had all these numbers. He said, I'm an engineer by training, so you can trust my math, he said. I've done the work. If we all became vegan and where we're currently raising livestock, we replanted the planet, and he had all the numbers, we will reverse, not just stop, reverse climate change in 10 years. I mean, I was stunned. And then you can also say, well, there is also a spectrum here. Maybe not everyone doesn't have to become vegan, but they can certainly give up this meat and this diet, that diet, and so on. Myself, I did give up beef about 28 years ago when I read Diet for New America by Robbins. But the point is that we can all do something in that arena. And for the younger generation to hear this, that by changing their diet, by letting go of the American diet of beef and chicken and everything else, that you can literally save the planet in your lifetime before you have children and grandchildren. Isn't that good news? So, I mean, we can't underestimate our capacity as humans. And like Karen pointed out, it's rather thrilling how in retreating to our homes these last couple of months, the air has gotten so wonderful. Rupert Sheldrake points out that there's a city in India that is about 40 miles from the Himalayan mountains, and they have not seen the mountains in over 40 years. Now, for the first time in 2 generations, everyone in the city is seeing these majestic, sacred mountains. The sacred is returning. And the implication of this, just like Karen alluded to, that we are capable of stopping the squirrel cages that we're in, and that's what letting go is. And so now religious traditions around the world teach the advantages of fasting. That's what Ramadan is about, that it's good for your health, etc., etc. But this is coming from the East. Well, fasting from meat diets is going to be not just good for your body, but very, very good for the planet and for future generations. So, but it requires this willingness to let go, this courage to let go. So, but again, fasting is a fine archetype of that. It's a pattern that we're all capable of, at least partially. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Yeah. Letting go and practices. I mean, those rituals are about practices of letting go and renunciation. And there's just such freedom and gifts that come from when we let go. I've recently moved to the country from the city, and it's very much of a simpler life, but it's so much richer for me at this time. And it's just letting go of my identity as an urban, as an urban professional. I'm scanning the text, the chat here for questions, and there's a number around the notion of sacred. You spoke a fair bit, Matthew, about reconnecting with the sacred. So I see that, Donna asks, how would you talk about the sacred in non-religious terms? And Jim says, as an agnostic Christian, how can he conceive of the sacred? Is it that which is life-giving, or help us think more about the sacred, Matthew?
Gary Schneider, the Buddhist poet who lives in the woods, up in the mountains in California, raised his family there. He defines the sacred as the wild, and I think there's a lot to be said there. That the sacred is that which we cannot domesticate. and tame. That's what I mean by saying it's what's bigger than us. It was here before us. It's not what we make, it's what makes us. And, we have to spend some time with that. Now, you have to taste it and experience it. There's never going to be a perfect definition for sacred. It's bigger than definitions. A lot of things in life are bigger than definitions. Beauty, for example. Someone said, you've never heard the phrase, something is beautiful because. You can't define beauty. You have to taste it. And the psalmist says that, taste and see that God is good. You have to taste the goodness of creation. We have to taste, and of course, sometimes it's loss and grief that brings you back to tasting again, or fasting. And see, in many ways, we're all fasting today. I mean, that's what being in our homes is about. We're fasting from our everyday experience. But the sacred speaks to you. It is that which is bigger than words. And you know it. And it does have something to do with the wild, because it's not tameable. And you have to ask yourself, well, when were the sacred moments in my life? Maybe when your first child was born, you tasted a great moment of the sacred. Or maybe when someone you loved died and you passed on. And so the breath, and that's the whole point, that everything is sacred. Every breath is sacred. Notice, be present for the first breath of a newborn baby or the last breath of a dying person. You know what sacred is. But all the breaths in between, it's so easy to take for granted. Oh, we're too busy. We're running in our squirrel cage. We're making money or something. Too busy. But that's where meditation comes in, to calm that reptilian brain. That life is not just about making money and surviving. It's also about being, and being with being, and being with beauty, and being with that which has been here so much longer than us and is so much wiser than we are. And I think it's very interesting that the word for taste in both Hebrew and Latin gives us the word wisdom. Chokmah in Hebrew and sapientia in Latin. Sapere means to taste in Latin. And so wisdom has something to do with tasting, not counting, not analyzing, though all those things are useful. But you want to talk about the sacred? We're talking about the sacred. You have to experience it. And you have to hang out with it. And you have to surrender to it, that it's bigger than us. And then you begin to realize, if life is sacred, well, every breath is sacred. And where does your breath come from? It comes from so many gifts of the air. I mean, air is really complicated. You scientists know it's better than me, but I've been reading, I love to read about air. It's complicated, what we call air. It's so wonderful, but did any of us, make that up? So I think that the sacred is, it's about our consciousness, about realizing that we're here as guests. And guests to the beauty and the wonder and the struggle of life. And the sacred is everywhere. And maybe an animal in your life has taught you the sacred. Or maybe music has taught you sacred. Or a good novel has taught you sacred. Or science has taught you sacred. You go deeper into the mysteries and the wonder and the beauty and the geometry and the patterns of science, of nature that you find in science. So, and lovemaking is sacred. That's why the Bible has a whole book about it, Song of Songs, that the fathers of the church tried to clean up. Say, oh, it's not about that. It's not about lovemaking. It's really about God loving the soul or something. No, ask any Jew. It's about lovemaking. They made the book, Lovemaking as Sacred. That, in the Jewish tradition, you're supposed to do two things on the Sabbath. One is to read the Song of Songs, and the second is to make love. That's how you celebrate the sacred in the real biblical tradition. So, yeah, it's everywhere, but all you have to do is wake up to it once. And then you're in a place where you can start saying, oh, is it there? Oh, is it there? How about the miracle of food? You know, I mean, one meal, where it all comes from. And by all comes from, I mean the history of food. I mean the history of the earth and the sun and the rain and the clouds and the soil and the seeds. It's miraculous. You know, Einstein said that. He said there are two ways to live your life, as if nothing is a miracle or everything is a miracle. Well, the sacred is the wonder of every moment and every being. And it's a pity if we discover this on our deathbed. It really is a pity.
I did a lot of work with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Matthew, which is they're in the lower part of British Columbia, the southwest coast, and they are fighting to stop the expansion of a pipeline. It was called the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Now it's called the Trans Mountain pipeline, from the tar sands to the coast. And while there's the issues of climate change and the issues of their sovereignty, the issue that they wanted us to feature in all of our banners and communication was that water is sacred. You know, they made beautiful banners and they did beautiful talks on the sacredness of water. And for them, the idea that we would ship oil to the coast and there'd be the potential for it to spill in the water was such a fundamental, basically a fundamental evil, that it was such a fundamental denial of that which was sacred.
Yeah, that's sacrilege. And remember, so I spoke with that from Bakostra, South Dakota, that you want to know how sacred water is, go without it for 3 days. Notice, I mean, that's a very practical, it's easy. I mean, it's simple, it's not easy, but you want to know what the sacred is, go without something for 3 days that is essential, that we can take for granted, like water. I mean, that's beautiful. And just that one example, how sacred water is. And therefore it is sacrilegious to be doing what we're doing with water, you say, to endanger it with oil or any other, what shall I say, capitalist gold.
Yeah. There's a whole number of questions in the chat, and I apologize, we are not going to get close to all of them. We will be able to continue tomorrow for those of you that are joining us tomorrow. There's a couple around, and so Matthew, I want to ask the impossible of you, which is, can you speak about mysticism for 2 minutes? And whether this, how and whether this crisis can help us reconnect with our mystical wisdom?
Well, for me, in a word, the mystic in us is a lover in us, the lover. Meister Eckhart talks about living without a why, W-H-Y, loving without a why, and working without a why. And so it is that realization of being fully present, It's not, it's not unlike Thich Nhat Hanh talking about mindfulness and being present to the earth and so forth. Mysticism is our capacity to experience the whole. Aquinas has this amazing teaching that he says that we are, how does he put it? The human, what makes humans so unique is that we're capable of the universe. And of course, now in our time, the universe has grown so gigantically, 2 trillion galaxies, but we're capable of it. I mean, we found this, and we can kind of imagine it, not really, but we can try, and we'll need artists and others to help us to try, and as we wrestle with this. But the point is that the mystic in us is expansive, And of course, Aquinas also says the soul grows by expansion, by joy. The joy enlarges the heart and grows the soul, expands it. So all that is our mystical experience, the experience of wanting. That was Julian Norwich's word, of feeling one with the universe. And this may happen out in nature. It may happen reading a book. It may happen in music. It often just hits us, and certainly in doing art and creating. And and the joys of family living and the rest, that there is this wanting that breaks through time and again. And the key is to render ourselves vulnerable to that and ready for it, so that we're not just on this busy, purposeful, working for a why, a purpose all the time, but that we have this other dimension to our souls and our existence. Then the via negativa is also the mystic, going into the dark night of the soul. We'll be talking about that more tomorrow. That's what we're in today as a species. I say that we should be talking about the dark night of our species, because the mystics name the extremes. They name the joy, the awe, the wonder, but also the nothingness and the ignorance. We do not know as a species today what's happening, what's going to happen. We could in fact, the odds, if you're a betting person, are on it that we will do ourselves in, and many other species with us. But we don't have to. But the point is that the dark night of the soul, the dark night of our species, is also named by the mystic and tasted. Just as we taste awe and wonder, so in joy, we also taste grief, emptiness, darkness, nothingness. And again, it's so important to be with those realities, those experiences, that oneness. And sometimes they morph. I'll never forget, years ago, I was lecturing on the Four Paths in Chicago, where I was living. And I talked about suffering, the via negativa, and how sometimes suffering is an ecstatic experience. Afterwards, a woman came up to me, she said, I had a son who was dying at 4 years of age. And I realized after all, there's nothing I could do for him but to sit by his bedside holding his hand. And she said, never in my life have I felt so close to the universe, to life and death, to history, to everything, as just sitting there holding my son's hand. She had let go of purpose and why. She knew she was there to save him from his mortality, but she was there to be present. And it was important that she said that, because the crowd had kind of erupted. It was in a Catholic basement. Of course, Catholicism, especially back then, had too much of priests saying that suffering is a good thing. But she came up and said for her, it was what I said it was. It was a mystical experience like none other in her life. So the mystics, they go to the extremes, and that's all of us. We're all mystics. We're all born mystics. All children are mystics, and unless bad parenting or school or bad culture drives it out of them, but we're all born with wonder, with their yearning for wonder and joy and play and celebration and sadness. So I think that's what Jesus meant by saying you adults should turn and become like children if you're going to receive the kingdom. The kingdom, the queendom of God is here already, but you're not seeing things. You live in these other worlds. So that's
beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. And we are going to spend some time in the via positiva and the via negativa tomorrow for those of you that can join us. Thank you so much, Matthew. We're at time, so I want to wrap it up. I see that Hollyhock has posted the link for tomorrow's workshop if you'd like to join us. Thanks again, Matthew. That was fantastic. There's a few ways to go deeper with this conversation. One is to join the workshop tomorrow. Another one is through Climate Hope. We're actually offering a series of experiential workshops that take people into each of these four paths. I think that someone from Hollyhock might climatehope.earth. What else do we want to tell you? Hollyhock is also doing a series of workshops that are free for the Hollyhock community. We are calling them Hawk Shops, looking at the skills of this time. And I'm going to be hosting one on June 8th, which is around grief, loss, and light. So those are some ways that if you're not joining us tomorrow, you can continue. And this video will be edited and put on the Hollyhock website, and also has been broadcast on Facebook Live. So it's there for your reference. I know there's many times I wished I was taking more copious notes. Thank you, Matthew, for your...
Just one thing. They could also go to my daily meditations, which are free.
Yes.
Just go to, what is it, dailymeditationswithmatthewfox.org. And I'm talking there about a lot of these things too as we're moving along. So
I've been getting the daily meditations for quite a while. And they're on about the 4 paths and specifically interpreting the events of this time through that lens. So I really recommend the daily meditations from Matthew. And there it is in the link, the Climate Hope Circles and the daily meditations. So I feel like we're just beginning. Of course, this is a conversation we're all going to be having for the rest of our lives about how do we make sense and find meaning in this crazy time. Thank you all for giving us some time on your Friday evening. I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow. And by way of closing, how about if we unmute everybody and just have the cacophony of goodbyes. I think that our hosts can unmute us and we can all just say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Good evening. Have a great day.
Bye.